Hi everyone, I had quite a few requests on doing a video to show how I made my pillow. So I have put together a slideshow of photographs that I took while I completed my pillow, and I've done a bit of a voiceover to explain what I was doing as I was going along. I will also provide two further links at the bottom of this video to show the YouTube videos that helped me actually complete my project. One is on the mitered corners and the second one is on the ladder stitch, which is what I use to hand sew the opening. So I hope you enjoy the video. If you have any questions or comments, please do so below and I will answer them as soon as possible. Thank you for watching and I'll speak to you all again soon. Bye! So the first thing you'll want to do is decide on the design size of your cross stitch project on the front of your pillow and work out what sort of border you would like around your actual stitching before the border of your pillow starts. I came to my size by having a look at my framed cross stitches around my home, and I noticed that the majority of them had a 1-inch border between the stitching and the mat board. And I decided I quite liked the look of that. But obviously, whatever size you want, that's completely up to you. I do suggest making it the same size all the way around your design to keep the look nice and uniform. So I decided on a 1-inch border. And once you decide on your size, you also need to add on your seam allowance. Now, for the purpose of this demonstration, I used a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance for all my seams. So with that in mind, I got out my tape measure and I measured from the furthest point of each side and top and bottom of my design. I measured out 1 1/4 inches and I cut along the grain for all 4 sides. Now before I go any further, it's probably best that I explain to you what my finished size of my design that I have now cut, just so that any measurements I give you from now on you can understand. My piece actually measures 11.5 inches wide by 9 inches high. Next, you'll need to decide what width of border you would like around your cross stitch. I'm talking the actual material now of the pillow. I decided on a 2-inch wide border around my cross stitch, and again, whatever amount you decide is fine. You will need to actually add on 2 lots of seam allowance this time, because 1 lot of seam allowance will be added to the Aida cloth or linen, whatever it is that you stitched on, and then on the other edge of the border you will need your seam allowance for adding the back of the fabric of your cushion. So I cut my strips 2 inches wide plus 2 lots of 1/4 inch. So I actually cut them 2.5 inches wide. So if you decide on a 3-inch border for your cushion, you will need to cut your strips 3 inches wide plus whatever your seam allowance is times 2. So if you use a 1/4 inch seam allowance like me, it will be 3.5 inch wide strip. If you choose a 4-inch wide strip, you'll need to cut them 4.5 inches wide. Now, to determine the length of the strips that you need to cut, you will need to cut them the length of the Aida or linen plus the width of your border on each end. So in my case, it's a 2-inch border, plus an additional 1 inch on each end to allow extra for the mitered corner, because you need a little bit of extra fabric to play around with. So the height of my design is 9 inches high. So in the photo you can see 2 strips that I have cut for my border, which are 2.5 inches wide, and the length of them is 9 inches, which is my design size, plus 2 inches on each end, plus an additional inch on each end, and that comes to a total of 15 inches. So I cut 2 pieces of 15 inches by 2.5 inches for my sides. And I repeat the process again for the top and bottom of my design. This time my width is 11.5 inches, so I determine my measurement by adding 11.5 inches plus my 2 inches on each end plus an additional 1 inch on each end, and that comes to a total of 17.5 inches. So my strips that were cut for the top and bottom measure 17.5 inches by 2.5 inches. And here you can see both lots of strips laid out, so it's easy to see the side panels are shorter than the top and bottom panels. And here I laid everything out in order just to make sure I had enough to fit and that I was happy with how it was all going to look before I went ahead with the next step. So next was iron-on interfacing, and I got this handy tip from Tara C. In her video. She explained how it's good to iron, or sew if you prefer, this onto the back of your cross-stitch design if you're using if you're making it into a cushion or a pin cushion, and it just protects the back of your stitching a little bit more. If you don't want to do this process, you don't have to. So I chose a lightweight iron-on interfacing, and in the next couple of photos you can see how I just ironed it onto the reverse side of my stitching just to protect it a little bit more. And it's clearly visible here that it's not cut to the exact shape as my Ada, but the edges will be covered by my seam allowance anyway, so the main point of the interfacing is just to protect the stitching. Okay, so we're going to work from the top and bottom of the design first and then the sides last. So you find the middle of your cross stitch, fold it in half and make a little mark at the top center, or you can place a pin if you don't want to draw on it, and you get your top piece of border, which will be the longest piece for me, and you find the center of that and make a little mark, and you join these marks up and pin them together with right sides together, of course. One little tip I found on another YouTube video was to actually mark the stitching points, the starting and stopping points of where I'm going to stitch on my design, because sometimes when it's under the machine it's a bit hard to judge and you could accidentally go over the 1/4 inch mark, and we didn't want to do that here. So using a quilting ruler that I had, I placed it on my design and I made a mark for the 1/4 inch stitching line. I then went and repeated that process for all 4 corners of my design. If you look carefully, you can see the 4 pen marks in the corners, and that is my stitching guideline. At this point, my cat decided she wanted to make an appearance and show her face on camera again. So now we stitch our 1/4 inch seam allowance along the side that we have pinned, starting at the 1/4 inch mark that I made with my pen and stitching a straight line down to the other pen mark. I always like to secure both ends of my thread by doing a few reverse stitches at the beginning and end of my stitching. Once that's done, you need to press your seams towards the border. And then I repeated the process again, finding the middle of my cross stitch design, finding the middle of the material, matching up those middle marks, pinning it together, right sides together, and then sewing the same 1/4 inch seam from the top and bottom markings. Once again, pressing the seam allowance towards the border. Repeat the process again for both sides of the design, exactly the same. So here is my border attached on all 4 sides, and as you can see there is an overhang on each corner, and that is the extra 1 inch we allowed when we cut our strips. So plenty of room for us to now make our mitres. The next step is to make sure that the top and the bottom borders are laying on top of the side borders. So next we're going to make a tiny little cut on the outside intersection corner. Now don't go berserk here, you only want a very small cut, something about 1/8 of an inch, and it's just going to be used as a guideline. Here is an example of the size of the cut. As you can see, it's really very small. That's all that you need. Now fold the top of the design over at the clipped point, lining the top border directly with the side border. Lay it flat and line up the little cut that you made. Now it's pretty important at this point to make sure all your edges line up correctly. You want all the straight edges lined up, and you want the little cut lined up with the mirror edge of the cut. Now using a ruler, line up the edge of the folded fabric right along to where you made the cut. You're going to draw a line here, and this will become your stitching line. And the line will go from the seam to the cut at the edge of the fabric. Pin it all into place. Now you just sew directly on the line that you just drew from the seam to the cut. Back stitch as well, and then remove your pins. Now open up the seam you just made and check the mitered corner and make sure you're happy with it before progressing to the next step. If you're not happy with it, you can easily unpick it and do it again. Now once you're happy with that mitered corner, you lay the ruler along the seam line that you've just stitched and line it up with the 1/4 of an inch mark, and then trim off the excess fabric with a rotary cutter. Open up the mitered corner and trim off the small excess fabric ends and give it all a press. So repeat that process again for the bottom of your design and then again for both sides. And hopefully it will finish looking something like this. So here you'll see that I've opened up my seam allowances and ironed them so that they're nice and flat to create less bulk inside the cushion. So next I got my backing fabric out and placed it face up on the table, and I placed my front of my cushion that I've finished stitching face down onto the fabric, and I pinned it in place and I cut around it for the exact size for the backing. I stitched it all in place using a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, but I left an opening at the bottom large enough to fit my hand so I could stuff the cushion, because I will be stitching that opening closed later by hand. And here is a picture of what it looks like from the rear, all stitched up. And the next process now is to just lightly clip the corners again to create less bulk from inside the cushion. So next you need to turn the whole thing inside out, and you'll need to poke out the corners gently with something not too pointy. I suggest using a chopstick, something like that. So gently poke those corners out so they're nice and flat, and give the whole piece another iron. Next you can stuff the pillow, and I just used general wadding here, and you can stuff it as full as you like. There are no rules. Make sure you get enough wadding stuffed into the corners as well. Once I was happy with the amount of stuffing inside my cushion, I pinned the opening closed, and I hand stitched it using a ladder stitch. I will put a link down below to the YouTube tutorial that I used for this, and it is a very good tutorial. Unfortunately, my hand stitching isn't so good. So I think I've mentioned before that I really don't like hand stitching, but I don't see this part of the cushion anyway, so I'm happy with how it turned out. So that's it, guys. My first handmade cushion, also my first attempt at mitered corners. It's not perfect by any means, but it is my first attempt and I'm really happy with it, and I can only get better from here on in. As I said, please check out the actual video of the lady who stitches this on camera, so you get a better idea of the process she uses. And thank you for watching.